Hello, and welcome to a Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 17, Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur Clarke is the lone British author of the Big Four of the Golden Age of Sci-Fi. Though he lived an ocean away from his compatriots, 2 oceans after he moved to what is now Sri Lanka in 1956, he was active in the community, with significant forays into the United States, and he was longtime friends with Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein. Besides the science fiction, Clarke may have been the most influential of the Big Four as a science writer, despite the fact that Asimov was more prolific at it. In fact, Clarke and Asimov had an agreement that Asimov was officially the better science writer, while Clarke was officially the better science fiction writer. However, Clarke may have had the bigger direct impact through his science writing, such as by popularizing the idea of geostationary satellites. Arthur Clarke's background in sci-fi was a little different from that of his friends. Unlike Asimov and Bradbury, who were big-time fans from an early age, Clarke attributed his interest in sci-fi to 3 specific works he read in his pre-teens: the November 1928 issue of Amazing Stories, Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, and David Lasser's non-fiction book, The Conquest of Space, which described a trip to the moon very accurately, based on the rocket technology of 1931. Clarke served in the Royal Air Force during World War II as a radar specialist, which allowed him to work closely with the cutting-edge technology of the time. He notably worked on the development of ground-controlled approach radar, which was later critical to the Berlin airlift. His only non-sci-fi novel, Glide Path, was a fictionalization of his work on ground-controlled approach. After the war, he obtained the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in mathematics, something that is very evident in his later life, and worked as an editor on a physics journal before making his living as an author. A decade after the war, still pretty early in his writing career, Clarke moved to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to pursue his interest in scuba diving. And he was a serious diver. Not long after he arrived, he discovered the underwater ruins of a temple that later became popular with tourists. He wrote multiple non-fiction books about diving in Ceylon, and later started his own diving school. Although a second reason why he relocated was likely the more tolerant laws regarding homosexuality in Ceylon at the time. Clarke was openly gay when asked about it, although he didn't advertise the fact. It's a bit ironic, in fact. He was arguably one of the most notable LGBT writers in the history of the genre, but it honestly doesn't figure into his writing to my eye. Regardless, this was only 2 years after the death of Alan Turing in what is generally agreed to be a suicide, so it's likely that was in Clarke's mind when he moved. Regardless, his writing career was already well underway by then. Like Bradbury, Clarke started his writing career publishing science fiction in fanzines in the late 30s, but he didn't publish professionally until after the war. His first professional sale, Loophole, was made to John W. Campbell's Astounding Science Fiction in 1946. While he continued writing short stories, what would become his first novel appeared not long after his professional debut in 1948. This was Against the Fall of Night. A novella at first, it was expanded and re-released twice, first as a novel of the same name in 1953, and finally as The City and the Stars in 1956. Just a heads up before we dive in. I feel like there are more spoilers than usual in this episode, but I feel like they're needed to fully understand Clarke's writing. A lot of the themes don't really get fulfilled until the end of many of these stories. Just so you're forewarned. The City and the Stars tells the tale of Earth in a far distant time, 1 billion years in the future. The city of Diaspar is believed by its citizens to be the last city on an Earth now devoid of oceans. The city has godlike technology. The people are immortal, unmade when they tire of life and reincarnated by the central computer as children, regaining their memories of their past lives when they reach adulthood. But the city is also a prison, believed to be the place where humans were confined to live by hostile aliens. Alvin is one of the very rare uniques, new people without past lives, and he desires to leave Diaspar. Outside, he finds that one other city remains, Lys, but it is the opposite of his home, an agrarian society where people live normal, finite lives. They have their own stories and their own superhuman advances. The people there have perfected telepathic communication. But they also have their own failings, and they seek to trap Alvin with them. Finally, Alvin finds a functional spaceship and travels to space, where he meets Vanamond, a powerful, incorporeal being of pure intellect, created as part of an ancient experiment. Vanamond tells him the real truth. The tales of both Diaspar and Lys are wrong. Instead, they are merely the people who chose to stay behind after most of humanity left the galaxy. Alvin then returns home, hoping to rebuild civilization on Earth. This is maybe the clearest example of one of Clarke's signatures: alien technology that seems supernatural, even spiritual in nature. We are assured that there's a rational explanation for everything that happens. Indeed, everything is explained in story as being done by technology. But it's so far beyond our comprehension that we can't even imagine what that technology is. Clarke tipped the balance a little further into the overtly spiritual in another of his early novels, Childhood's End. Clarke wrote extensively on spiritual and religious themes, more than any of the big four, even going beyond Heinlein's Church of All Worlds in Stranger in a Strange Land. He seems to have been exploring the subject in multiple ways, much like Asimov explored robo-psychology or Heinlein explored social taboos, especially seeing how his own religious views are surprisingly hard to pin down. Clarke variously described himself as a pantheist, a quote-unquote crypto-Buddhist, and a logical positivist, and eventually instructed that no religious rites should be done at his funeral. Childhood's End doesn't fit into any of these boxes, but it shows hints of all of them. It begins when powerful but secretive aliens called the Overlords show up and take over the world. Not apparently hostile, they usher in a new golden age of peace, justice, and prosperity for humanity, but they seem to stifle creativity and development. Decades later, after the potential opposition has vanished, the Overlords finally show their faces, revealing an appearance like classical demons, hoofed feet, horns, forked tails, and all. A fact they attribute to a collective psychic premonition of what they would bring in the future. Some time later, supernatural phenomena begin happening, culminating in the children of Earth, and only the children, ascending to incorporeal form and joining the Overmind, a vast cosmic intelligence formed from a hive mind of millions of civilizations. Something close to a capital G god, but not quite. Neither a creator nor a perfect, all-encompassing pantheism, but in some sense omnipresent. It's honestly hard to parse what kind of story this is. The summary reads like a tragedy, if not a dystopian horror. And indeed, the 2015 Sci-Fi Channel adaptation definitely leaned that direction. But the book itself mostly doesn't. As the title suggests, its themes are more about growing up, putting aside childish things, and spiritual fulfillment. It's an attitude that might fit better in Clarke's crypto-Buddhist belief system. Although he wrote the book several years before he moved to Sri Lanka, so he probably wouldn't have been involved with that at the time. Nonetheless, Childhood's End was Clarke's own favorite of his novels, alongside The Songs of Distant Earth. Much like his contemporaries, Clarke wrote plenty of short stories, and a couple of them are particularly worth mentioning. There's The 9 Billion Names of God, in which Tibetan monks use computer technology to print off all of the possible names of God. In a play on the classic Towers of Hanoi myth, this is an impossibly long task that they believe will cause the universe to end when it is completed, since the purpose of creation will be fulfilled. But since they're still 15,000 years from finishing, they decide to automate the process. The computer gets the job done in only a few hours, and then, quote, overhead, without any fuss, the stars were going out. Unquote. Another of his famous short stories is The Star, where space explorers are studying the ruins of an alien civilization that was destroyed by a supernova. The Jesuit priest on the mission eventually adds up the dates and discovers that the supernova was, in fact, the Star of Bethlehem, which naturally leads him to a massive crisis of faith. I could also mention Clarke's novel A Fall of Moondust, a story reminiscent of the Poseidon adventure, in which a passenger liner on the moon is caught in a cave-in, and sinks into the talcum-fine dust that covers the lunar surface and has to be rescued by difficult technological means. But the most famous of Clarke's works is undoubtedly his 1968 novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, and of course the Stanley Kubrick movie that was based on it. 2001 is a bit of an oddity because it wasn't a novelization of the movie, but nor was the movie an adaptation of the book. Instead, they were developed concurrently at Kubrick's behest, which would ordinarily lean towards the book being a novelization, except that both were, in fact, based on Clarke's earlier short story, The Sentinel. The novel was also intended to come out first. Unfortunately, due to complications and publication delays, it didn't come out until several months after the movie, much to Clarke's annoyance. There are also significant differences between the book and the movie. Most notably, in the book, the discovery goes to Saturn, not Jupiter. Kubrick didn't think he could show Saturn on film convincingly, so he changed it. Remember, this was before we had sent any spacecraft to the outer planets. And in his defense, Saturn is the fakest-looking object in the sky. Viewed through a telescope, it almost looks like it was painted on the lens. Anyway, the story begins with the dramatic fanfare of Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra. Ahem. With mysterious but very powerful aliens surveying the galaxy for promising worlds. I'll talk more about the movie in the next episode. The aliens place a monolith on Earth, which uplifts a group of primitive hominids to greater intelligence. 3 million years later, these hominids have become humans, and they have discovered a similar monolith on the moon, and another much larger one sitting on the surface of Saturn's moon, Iapetus. Normally pronounced Iapetus, but Clarke was a purist, and interpreted the Latin name as beginning with a J. In the movie, of course, it's orbiting Jupiter. The spaceship Discovery 1 is sent to Saturn to investigate the monolith, only for its onboard supercomputer, HAL 9000, to go insane and try to kill its crew. Only Dave Bowman survives to reach the monolith. His last transmission to Earth, "Oh my god, it's full of stars." The monolith turns out to be a quote-unquote Stargate, not to be confused with the 1994 movie and subsequent TV shows. It's an artificial wormhole created by the aliens to travel to thousands of star systems around the galaxy. By the time the aliens are through with him, Bowman is transformed into the Star Child, a powerful incorporeal being who is able to travel through space on his own, and you're probably noticing a theme here. If you've only seen the movie, you should definitely read the book. The movie is a cinematic milestone, but it's not very accessible to the average viewer. Meanwhile, one of the best reviews I once saw for the book ended with, "Wow, I understand the movie now." I'm going to leave off our discussion of Clarke here for now. This isn't his whole career, but this episode is getting kind of long, and more to the point, we're really moving out of the Golden Age by now. I think Arthur Clarke was the best of the Big Four at turning out really big titles all the way to the end of his life. Rendezvous with Rama, The Fountains of Paradise, the 2001 sequels, all of them were his big releases of the 70s and 80s, long after the Golden Age was over. You might see Heinlein's The Number of the Beast or The Cat Who Walks Through Walls on the lists of classics. You might see Asimov's later Foundation novels, but Clarke had come through the new wave of the 60s more popular than ever. The others were still a big deal, but they didn't quite have the same ongoing star power. In fact, Rendezvous with Rama was the first book of a then unprecedented 3-book publishing deal, the biggest ever given to a sci-fi author at the time. And I can't find the source, but The Fountains of Paradise was presumably the third. So those books will appear in a later episode. After that, it's admittedly a bit downhill. Most of Clarke's books from the late 80s onward were co-written, possibly due to his declining health, with Clarke often taking a back seat and mainly providing the framework of the story, while someone else wrote the text, with mixed results. His last solo-written book was 3001 in 1997. But there's another piece to this puzzle. Like I said at the beginning, of the Big Four, Clarke probably had the largest contribution to actual science. Even though he wasn't quite as prolific as a science writer, his focus on space exploration in particular had a big impact. As early as 1950, he wrote the nonfiction book Interplanetary Flight, An Introduction to Astronautics, where he gave a moderately technical analysis for laypeople of the challenges of space travel, before anyone had launched into space yet. He later wrote several more nonfiction books about space travel. Clarke wasn't the first to think of geostationary satellites, which stay over a particular location on Earth to communicate with it continuously, but he did popularize the idea in a letter to the editor of Wireless World in 1945. Today, the geostationary orbit is called the Clarke orbit. He also popularized the idea of the space elevator, which figures heavily in his later books, but of course hasn't yet been implemented. He predicted many aspects of our modern society decades before they happened, including GPS satellites, satellite television, cell phones, online banking and shopping, and something he called a global library, which of course brings to mind the internet today. In his youth, he had also been interested in paranormal phenomena, to the point where they were one of his inspirations for Childhood's End. But he became a hardcore skeptic over time. In the 90s, he created several TV shows investigating and debunking the paranormal. Although despite his skepticism, he still had some odd ideas, especially around his original field of mathematics. Clarke got pretty deep into the fractal craze around the same time he created those shows. If you're not familiar with fractals, Google's tribute to Benoit Mandelbrot a few days before this recording might be a good place to start. I remember seeing Clarke's 1995 documentary about fractals called The Colors of Infinity as a child. At the time, I was dazzled by the visuals and the ideas they embodied, and I still take an interest in fractals today. But I re-watched the show on YouTube recently, and he went to some weird places, even seeming to attribute an almost mystical power to fractals. He went in that same direction in his novel The Ghost of the Grand Banks, which apparently had a whole subplot about the Mandelbrot set shoehorned into a book about raising the Titanic. I'm not sure how that worked. It apparently wasn't very good. And also, no one calls it the M set. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like an attempt to make it sound more universal and otherworldly by someone who can't use the jargon convincingly. I'm sure Clarke was a good mathematician, but he really missed the mark on that one. The point is, this tension between the skeptical and the mystical reflects probably the most famous of his nonfiction writings today, which is Clarke's third law. Funny how people don't talk nearly as much about the first two, but I'll save you the trouble and give you all three. Clarke's first law: when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. Clarke's second law: the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that third law feels very familiar to us today. A computer seems pretty magical, doesn't it? Well, maybe not if you're used to it, especially if you're much younger than I am, but seriously, think about it. I met Neil deGrasse Tyson in about 2012 or 2013, and around that time, he was fond of holding up an iPhone and saying, "Even 10 years ago, you would have been burned as a witch for having one of these," because it was such a huge leap in how we interact with technology. So we can get what Clarke is saying here, or so we think. The thing is, Clarke doesn't seem to mean your typical fantasy magic where you point a wand and say Wingardium Leviosa, things where, even if they don't follow normal physics, you can kind of see how they work and even scientifically analyze them to some degree. That's what would describe the iPhone. But instead, Clarke's aliens tend to be godlike beings, sometimes incorporeal, their minds vast and alien, and their powers miraculous, completely beyond our ken. Remember the Overmind, which is pretty much an actual deity in Childhood's End. It was mostly later authors who realized that Clarke's third law works in both senses. The hard magic version works perfectly fine, and it seems to be the sense in which most people take it today, especially with the number of people who have turned it around, Larry Niven probably the first of them, with variants along the lines of, any sufficiently analyzed magic is indistinguishable from technology. This seems to be the direction fantasy literature has gone, with writers like Brandon Sanderson writing very rigorously defined magic systems, and there's a lot to be said for that as a literary device. In contrast, Clarke's soft magic sense of godlike or spiritual powers is somewhat surprising by today's standards. With the modern push for a theory of everything that started in the 70s and 80s, we feel like we understand enough of physics that there wouldn't be any huge surprises like the overmind or the monoliths. Likewise, the Church-Turing thesis hypothesizes that everything in the universe that can be calculated, at least to as many decimal places as we care about, can be calculated on an ordinary computer, not even a quantum one, given enough time. The universe, it says, is Turing complete, and therefore on some level always comprehensible. And while we don't know if it's true, we've never found anything to disprove it. Even Clarke himself seems to lean away from his earlier usage in 3001, with the monoliths being susceptible to computer viruses. So if you read Clarke, you're going to see a spread of different versions of this trope, some familiar, some inscrutable. That's a pattern that continues throughout his later novels too, albeit in different ways, and it certainly lends a unique flavor to his work. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available on all the major podcasting platforms and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Now for my book recommendation. Arthur C. Clarke is actually my favorite of the big four authors. I find most of his books to be real page-turners, and I've gone the furthest out of my way with him to read books beyond the list of classics. For my recommendation, I already mentioned 2001: A Space Odyssey as a better alternative to the movie, and it is a very good book. But I'm going to be contrarian and say that you should read The City and the Stars. And yes, I know I gave away the ending, but I still think it's worth reading. This book is the one where Clarke best flexes his muscles on the sufficiently advanced technology, to the point where it looks truly spiritual and magical, but still clearly has science behind it. It's a fun story and pleasantly off the beaten path, and you should check it out. In the next episode, we'll finish our study of the golden age of science fiction by coming back around to the other popular genre of the day. It's time for the golden age of sci-fi movies. Thanks for listening.